right, well, I think we'll get underway. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues, our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Tina Rosenberg. Tina is the Marquette University Social Entrepreneur in Residence for this fall. She is the co-founder of the Journalism Solutions Network. Solutions Journalism Network. She is also the co-writer of the Fixes blog on the Opinionator section of the New York Times online edition. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist. She was a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation's Genius Grant a few years ago. She's done an awful lot of interesting things, and we're going to talk about that and the future of journalism today. So won't you please give a warm welcome to Tina Rosenberg. Good to have you here. We were just talking about the state of journalism before we turned on our mics, which was an interesting conversation. But let's talk about solutions journalism, because you're a proponent of that. And maybe you can begin by helping us understand what it is and what it isn't.
Right. Well, as everybody knows, the reigning myth of journalism is that we cover problems. And that's all we do. And that the solution to those problems is not our business. Someone else will come in and take care of that. And our view at the Solutions Journalism Network is that that model has failed. It doesn't, it's not a good model for helping society learn what it needs to improve itself, which is what the purpose of journalism should be. And so our view is that it is a perfectly legitimate part of journalism to cover, in addition to problems, what's going on to respond to those problems. And that it should be done and can be done in a way that is serious, rigorous, meets all the standards of journalism that traditional stories do, not advocacy, not public relations, not fluff, and that journalists should have this as part of their toolkit. And when they cover their beats or do their enterprise projects or investigative projects, they should always be thinking about, where can I go to see people solving this problem? Or where can I go to see people who are doing a better job of this? And cover that and show people what is happening here that isn't happening elsewhere that we can learn from.
You made a couple of distinctions there, and let me follow up on those. The notion that this is not advocacy journalism. Help us understand why it's not what we see in so many different media venues today.
Well, a lot of journalists are afraid, I can't do this because I'm not an advocate. That's not. Right. And covering solutions is automatically assumed to be advocacy, and it's not. When you're covering a solution, you're only looking at what some people are doing and what effect it's having. It's reporting. It's the same kind of reporting as if you were covering what people were doing and what effect it was having when these people were creating a problem. You're not going to overclaim. You're not going to say, this is the best solution. This is the key. This is the future. All you're going to do is say, here's what's going on, and here's what the evidence shows is happening because of it. And that's not advocacy. That's covering the news, and that's covering it in a more it's giving people the whole story.
People, Tina, should also not be confused. This is not what is sometimes called good news journalism, where you're just doing, oh, here's a positive story with a happy ending. It's not that either, is it?
No, it's not, and that's an important distinction. It's not about heroism or good intentions. It's about the work. It's about what is happening here that isn't happening elsewhere, and why is this being successful. It's trying to add important knowledge to society, not just make people feel good.
Have you always held this belief of what journalism should be? I was reading something about you, and you said, and Tina's done a lot of reporting for the New York Times Magazine over the years, and you were talking about a story you were reporting. You were talking about the AIDS epidemic, and I think you went to Brazil.
That's right.
And you went to Brazil because Brazil was having some success in terms of dealing with the AIDS epidemic.
That's right.
Was it an aha moment for you, an epiphany of sorts, or have you always felt this way about what journalism should be?
I haven't always. And in fact, my career was fairly traditional for a long time. And I covered human rights and poverty. I spent a lot of time in Latin America and in Eastern Europe. And, I've depressed myself and my readers pretty thoroughly, I think. And then I started to get interested in what was going on to solve these problems. But the Brazil story came up because my editor, well, I had proposed to my editor, this was back in 2000, that I wanted to do a story about how people in the third world, where the AIDS burden was the highest, had no access to AIDS medicines because it was too expensive, therefore it was a death sentence. And I pitched this story to him, and he said, sorry, we're not interested. Too depressing. We know it already. We're sort of burned out on this kind of thing. And then I came back to him and said, well, what if I don't set it in one of the 70 countries I could have set it in where people did not have this medicine? What if I set it in the one country where people did, which was Brazil? Brazil had a policy of providing free triple therapy to everyone in the country that needed it. And they did it by making generic copies of brand name pharmaceuticals, which was pissing off the pharmaceutical industry royally. And Washington, which is the patron of the pharmaceutical industry, was getting involved to try and step on Brazil not to do this. One of our more well thought out foreign policies, I think, which we're still doing in a way. But so this story was done then with the lens of what was going on in Brazil. Through it, I showed what the problem was and what Brazil had to fight off to get there. So it was an investigative story in that sense. It was exposing. If definition of investigation is exposing things that people don't want to be exposed, it had that portion to it, but it was done with the frame of here's what's working. The advantages of this story were numerous. It was fresh. It created a huge amount of reader response. At the time, the United Nations was debating whether to set up the global fund for AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, and the pharmaceutical industry was arguing you shouldn't do this because poor countries don't have the capacity to do this kind of thing. And this story showed that was not true. They do have the capacity. And so it was, I don't have any evidence for this, but I was told that it was an influential story in persuading the UN that this needed to happen. And of course, now every country is doing what Brazil is doing, and it's probably one of the most important global health success stories of our time. So the story was a much better story, a much bigger story, and a much more impactful story because it had the solutions lens to it. And that, I think, made me think.
You talk about the feedback you got to something like that, and this is something I think that's interesting. Do you think there's a demographic factor here that young people in particular want solutions? They don't want just to know about the problem. What do I do about it? Is there sort of a demographic factor in the terms of popularity of this sort of journalism?
I think everybody wants.
Sure.
Everybody's tired of all Armageddon all the time. I think everybody needs to be able to read about things that are going on that show that society can solve some of its problems. But I think young people in particular. I mean, there's all this research showing that this generation is so interested in social change and in social innovation and in doing things to make a difference in the world. And that's not reflected. That vision of the world is not reflected in journalism. And people need that.
Why do you think it's not reflected in journalism? What are the people who do this for a living on a day-to-day basis? Why can't they see this?
What the hell are they thinking?
What are they doing?
I think it's partly that it's not seen as part of the basic mission of journalism, which is uncovering problems. In part, it's because they don't see anybody doing it. And I think once they do see people doing it, and may I point out that one of the premier practitioners of this is the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. The series that's running now called Chronic Crisis, which is by Meg Kissinger about Milwaukee's treatment of people with mental illness, has had two, and is about to have a third, really great solutions-oriented story that makes the series much more powerful. She's shown what Houston has done to work on this problem in a different way, and overtly says, here's what Milwaukee can learn from this. And then Meg went to Giel, Belgium, which is a city that's had a 700-year tradition of people taking mentally ill people into their own homes. And she wrote about that as well. And this was really a perfect example of solutions journalism, and I now cite that as a model when I talk to other newspapers. But I think once people see that it's a model and that, reputable newspapers like the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, I'm right, it's a reputable newspaper, are doing this, then I think it's going to start spreading. Yep.
So give me a sense of, you're writing, co-writing, the Fixes column in the Opinionator section of the New York Times online edition. When you're looking for subject matter, what is it you're looking for? And I maybe we can use an example. I read something you wrote back a couple of weeks ago about a new way of teaching. Why did that appeal to you? Why was that the subject of a column?
Okay. Well, that column, I'm actually writing a follow-up on that, to that this
I bet that got a lot of response.
It did.
Yeah.
It's called The Flipped Classroom, and basically it's people sitting down and saying, what is the best use of my precious time in my class one-on-one with my students, and concluding that the best use of that time is working directly with students, and the best use of that time is not lecturing, and they're recording their lectures, putting them online so kids can watch them at home. So
as many times as
they want. If they don't understand it, they can pause the teacher and go back again. So their homework is watching the lectures. And in class, they're doing what we would normally call homework. They're working through the problems, doing exercises. But now you're doing it with someone who can actually help you, or sitting there, because a lot of people don't have parents who can help them at home. And so this is an idea that has. It was invented by two chemistry teachers in Colorado. It's a very bottom-up movement, and they are sparking this revolution. So what I liked about it, we have 4 criteria for fixes. We look for things that are innovative, that are replicable. You know, you're doing it, I can possibly do it too. That have evidence of success, and that offer us a way to write about what we consider to be an important issue in social change. And this did fit all that criteria.
Yeah, and what's the second piece going to be about, if I might ask?
It's going to be about an even more arcane version of the flipped classroom called the flipped mastery classroom. Mastery is, in a normal education, time is a constant and understanding is a variable. We're going to work on multiplication for 3 weeks, and at the end of that, we're going to move to greatest common factors. And if you didn't understand, that's too bad. You know, we're still moving to greatest common factors. What mastery is saying, you're going to work on this till you understand, and then you can move on to the next unit, no matter how much time it takes you. That's not a new idea, but it has been completely impractical up until now, because there's no possible way a teacher can be providing the basic material to people at many different levels in the same classroom. However, technology, the recording of the lectures, now allows that to happen. So there are classrooms that are starting to do this, and it's very interesting.
And that's going to be out in the next...
It'll be out in a week from today.
Okay, we'll look forward to that. So you mentioned you've co-founded with Dave Bornstein and a few others this Solutions Journalism Network. What exactly is it you do? It's more than encouragement, isn't it? Is there a financial incentive? What are you hoping to do with it?
Our goal is that within 5 years, newsrooms across the United States will always think about whether they can do a solutions angle onto a story, that it's going to be just part of the standard toolkit. And so we're trying to legitimize the idea, explain to people what it is, and also work with newsrooms that want to do it and feel like they need some collaboration. So, for example, we're working with the Seattle Times on an 18-month project. They are doing a series on solutions in education. And their first big piece is going to come out, I think, in 2 weeks. But we've been there every month, and we'll be going back and forth to work with them on it. And we're starting these kinds of collaborations in various newsrooms. And we also just go around and give workshops and talks about it. We also run story funds. You can apply in certain categories. For example, we've done one on responses to climate change. If you're doing a story that's got a solutions focus, you can apply and win money to do reporting on that. So various kinds of things to help promote and spread this practice. And it's called a network because, I mean, David and I like writing the fixes column, but we don't want to be doing the solutions journalism ourselves except for that column. We want to create a network of people that doesn't need to come through us. People can collaborate together and help each other and post. We'll have a place where people can post their work, et cetera. But we want to have a network of people working on this that we don't necessarily have to be the intermediary for.
You mentioned the Seattle Times. You mentioned the work of the Journal Sentinel. Mm-hmm. Have you had a pretty good reception from other major newspapers, for instance? Has television news expressed interest in this concept?
We've had a very good reception, much better than we thought, including from some of the most hard-hitting investigative newsrooms, like ProPublica is very interested in this. The Center for Investigative Reporting in San Francisco is very interested in this. So we were afraid when we started that we would get this, that's advocacy, that's public relations. We have not heard that at all. And if we get that initially, we can usually, within the space of a 10-minute conversation, convince people otherwise. We've had some interest from television. So far, we have not had any formal relationship with a TV station. We've worked with radio. We've worked with online platforms. We have had interest from individual TV reporters but so far, we really need the top editor to be on board with this before we can come in. There's no point in going in unless the top editor is interested in it, because otherwise nothing's going to happen. Right. The one place we have is actually from the BBC, but we don't have the capacity right now to work outside the United States, so we have to put that on hold for a little bit.
One of the things that you're involved with is helping the journalists of tomorrow, or younger journalists. You have this relationship with Marquette now as part of this Fixes You program. What is Fixes You? What are you hoping to do here at Marquette and elsewhere?
Right. Well, there's two different things. One is Fixes You, which is not about journalism. That's about using the Fixes columns as a basis, and adding other things as well, for a curriculum about social innovation, which Marquette is the lead university on, and they're hoping to create this online curriculum that will be in use in 500 classrooms around the country by next year. And that's for courses in social innovation. What we're hoping also to do with the Diederich College of Communications is start work very soon on a journalism curriculum, on solutions journalism for J schools.
And how did the relationship come about? Help people understand in this room.
Through Lori Bergen, who is just a dynamo. I mean, she's unbelievable, very, very energetic, very interested in really shaking up the field. And I think we were, I don't remember how we first met her, but it was through her that we started to work with Diederich. I mean, we had been talking with other, frankly, more bigger name J schools like Medill, right. And in the end decided that this Marquette was a much better fit, and Lori was, and her school was a much better fit for us, and would really run with this.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested to see how that works in the next couple of years.
It also fits with Marquette's mission. Be the difference,
Absolutely.
Be the change.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's a whole university-wide emphasis now on social innovation and social entrepreneurship, and not only in Diederich, but in the business school, the education school, and that's great. And I think this fits in very well with that.
One of the things that Tina's done is she writes the column, clearly, and she's done the longer form pieces in prominent magazines, but you've also written a book that also sort of deals with this notion of the social cure. And you wrote this book a couple of years ago, Join the Club, and it's about peer pressure. And I think most of us have a somewhat negative connotation about peer pressure. This book takes exactly the opposite position and talks about the benefits of positive peer pressure. How did you come about that as a topic, or is it just a logical extension of your interests?
I came about it because I had gone to South Africa for the New York Times Magazine to write about the challenges of fighting AIDS not the technological stuff and the medical stuff, but the social, the psychological, the cultural barriers to fighting AIDS. For example, getting people to use condoms, getting people to adopt less risky behaviors. And I came upon their teen AIDS prevention program, which was called Love Life, which is a deliberate pun. And it sought to get kids to make better choices by giving them a group to belong to and a reason to feel connected to other people and a reason to make better choices. And if you looked at their website, you would never think that it was about AIDS. It looked like basically a teen fashion or gossip magazine. But it used the power of peer pressure to to draw people into changing their lives, to thinking, you know, my friend has changed his life, I can change mine, I can be like my friend. Then that was a government program designed to change the most personal behaviors of individuals. Then a couple of years later, I was talking to a young man named Ivan Marovic, who was a Serb student in the 1990s when a group of 11 kids from Belgrade University decided they were going to overthrow Slobodan Milosevic. Everybody laughed at them, but in fact, they did. I mean, 2 years later, when Milosevic was deposed, they were a huge reason why. They eventually built up a movement that had at least 70,000 people. I mean, they stopped counting after a while. And the way they got people to become political in a country that was really, at that point, very alienated, fatalistic, scared. People didn't want to be political in Serbia. They wanted to go inside and shut their door and not be out in the streets. They basically made it a party. I mean, small p, not capital P. And they had these great T-shirts and great music, and they would do these funny street events, and their patron saint was Monty Python's Flying Circus. That was sort of what they modeled themselves after. And they gave people the chance to get into trouble and be dangerous and get arrested, and kids loved this. They would compete to get arrested the most times. And as Ivan described what was going on, I realized this is the same technique, essentially. Drawing people into changing their behavior, into thinking of themselves in a different way. They changed people's self-image. They're no longer a passive victim of dictatorship. Now they were sort of their own James Bond. And they did it through peer pressure. And I started to think, here's an anti-government program, about the most anti-government you can possibly be, that's designed to change a very public political behavior. And it uses the same techniques as the South Africa program that had so little in common with it. So I wanted to look at what was the pattern here. So I started to then look into peer pressure. And the thesis of the book in 2 sentences is people don't change their behavior because you give them new information. They don't change their behavior because you scare them in some way. They change their behavior because they identify with other people who have made that change. And the classic version is Alcoholics Anonymous. But this can also be used in so many different settings. Health, education, political change, poor country development, anti-poverty work. And so that's what the book is about.
You had a great example in the book where you're talking about teen smoking in Florida. Mm-hmm. And again, teens are bombarded with information about how bad smoking is for you. And yet they smoke because, hey, you're rebelling against what we're all telling you.
Exactly.
It's bad for you.
Teens actually
then I'll do it,
overestimate the danger of smoking. They think it's even worse than it really is.
So tell the story of what they did in Florida that actually produced results.
Mm-hmm. Well, Florida was one of the first 3 states to file a lawsuit against the tobacco companies. And when they started to get money, and also importantly, the discovery process began, and they uncovered all these documents that showed how the tobacco companies had actually been targeting teenagers, despite their insistent denials that they were doing that. Florida hired an ad agency, which had never done public health work, very smart decision, but did know how to market to teens. And they sat down and said, why do teens smoke? For a teenager, a cigarette is not a delivery system for nicotine. It's a delivery system for rebellion, which is exactly why the standard messages backfire. Teens think that smoking is more dangerous than it actually is, but that's one of the reasons they smoke. So they can rebel against authority. They can show people how autonomous and how cool they are and how grown-ups can't tell me what to do. So they recruited 600 teenagers from across the state, and they grouped them together at this Teen Tobacco Summit. And during that weekend, they wrote all these TV ads, and they filmed them. The teenagers wrote them. And basically, the ads were looking at the tobacco companies as people who were it was turning the rebellion of teens that they usually use to smoke into rebellion against the tobacco companies. So they would, for example, one ad was, this one they filmed a little later, they took a road trip from Florida up to Richmond, Virginia, which was the headquarters of Philip Morris. And they got out of the car and stopped at the gate and said to the guard, we want to talk to the Marlboro man. And the guard who was clueless,
and was honest,
said, "I'm sorry, you can't because he's dead." And in fact, the model who played him on TV had just died. Anybody know what he died of? And they filmed all this and they put it on the air. Or they filmed themselves making prank phone calls to tobacco company executives and advertising executives who did tobacco projects. And in collaboration with this, they started these little groups in every county in Florida of kids who did these street actions. And they were very similar to the ones that the Serb student movement did. They would do die-ins. They would, lie down. They would choose a building where there was some tobacco activity going on inside, like a local headquarters of a company or an ad agency. And they would lie down on the sidewalk like this, and people would draw around them with chalk, like a crime scene. These kinds of pranks. And it was hugely successful. It was the first time in history that anything had done this, had really reduced teen smoking. And then this program went nationwide 2 years later, and over the 10 years from 1997 to 2007, teen smoking in the United States was cut in half.
I want to switch gears a little bit because we'll open it up to your questions in just a moment. But you've written a lot about foreign policy, and you just touched on what happened with the Serb rebellion. And I know that, and you told me, you said, I'm not an expert on what's happening in Syria or Egypt, but you have written about why some rebellions are successful, why things, how things change, what are some common factors in the change, and why sometimes the push for change is met with success and sometimes it's not. Any thoughts about what we've seen in the last few years, especially in places like Syria, in places like Egypt?
Well, what I wrote about was nonviolent rebellion. Mm-hmm. When is it that nonviolent rebellion is successful, and when is it that you have these phenomenally, gripping episodes that then flame out and everybody gets arrested and then dictatorship shuts down again? And one of the keys, I think, was what we saw initially in Egypt in Tahrir Square, the 1st January, and they actually went to Serbia for training. So they learned a lot from these Serbs who now have this organization where they travel the world training nonviolent democracy movements. And basically they turned Tahrir Square into this place where you just had to be there, because what are you going to tell your grandchildren if you weren't there? And it's where everybody was going. It's where your friends were going. And then they created in the square this wonderful atmosphere of unity where the Muslims protected the Coptic Christians while they prayed, and then the Coptic Christians protected the Muslims, and they would hand roses to the police and the military. And it was good because it reassured the rest of Egypt that we are peaceful, we're nonviolent, we're not going to, we're not going to be stringing you up if you were partisan of the old regime. And that really helped their cause. It made what could have been a very small movement into a very large movement. Now, what's happened since then is a different story. And sometimes people think, well, that movement was not a success because of look at what's happened since then. And my response to that is that movement was a success. What you were trying to do was create a system where Egyptians could choose their own government. And they did do that. They chose badly. But that's what democracy is. And there's obviously imperfections, and perhaps the elections were not as free as you'd want and gave advantages to certain groups that should not have had those advantages. But nevertheless, it was a successful democracy movement. And one of the Serbs have advised several of these. And one of the things that is important is to plan this as carefully as you'd plan a military campaign. It is no different, except you're not using weapons, which makes sense because weapons is the one area where you know the dictatorship is going to win. That's the area where they have the monopoly and they're very strong. So if you do this in the nonviolent field and you follow certain principles that are as clearly thought out as Clausewitz's principles on how to wage a military campaign, then you'll have more success. Mm-hmm. But this is not accidental. You can't just sort of run a Hail Mary play every time and then hope it's going to happen.
Latin America, you wrote a book on some of the violence in Latin America. It seems to me, I don't know, it's not a very prominent part of our foreign policy. We don't talk much about the continent to the south of us. We seem fixated on other parts of the world. There are some good reasons for that. But are you surprised that we don't spend more time and effort in terms of trying to build relationships with folks who just live a little bit to the south of us?
When I was there was a saying among the journalistic community that there are no Latin stories in the United States. There's just U.S. stories in a Latin American setting. What that meant was, we were all interested in the wars in Central America because they were U.S. wars. I mean, we were funding one side. And so they were really American issues. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, we're most interested in it when it's basically us. But frankly, one of the reasons we're not so interested in Latin America anymore is that it's boring, and that is really good. They are normal, boring societies where they argue about, are we paying too many taxes, and what do we do about our educational system? And that's just not news anymore. But I'm really happy that they're not. That's what they're arguing about, and they're not arguing about, guerrilla wars and military dictatorships for the most part.
Tina won a Pulitzer back in the mid-'90s for a book called The Haunted Land, and it was about how some Eastern European nations were faring after the collapse of communism. I asked you earlier, do you follow the events in places like the Czech Republic or Poland or some of the places that you've written about, or was that a book for a certain moment and you've kind of moved on with things since then?
I have not followed it as carefully, in part because it was a book about how to deal with the past and how these countries were dealing with the past, how they were making decisions about who was guilty and of what, and who gets to judge, and whether you can imprison people who shot wall jumpers in Berlin because they were only following orders after all, or these very, very difficult political and moral dilemmas about retroactive justice. So that's an issue that is all over the world now. In every place where they've had a transition to democracy or an end to a civil war or an ethnic war, they have these questions to deal with. And so it's not, the book wasn't, it was set in Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Germany, but it wasn't really a book about those countries precisely. But it is interesting to see how there's now organizations like the International Center for Transitional Justice that go around and advise different countries on what has worked in other places and what has not worked on dealing with the past, and that's really interesting.
And do you have another book in the works, or are you just going to take a breather now?
No. The one thing I wrote most recently is a little bit out of character. It's an e-book. It's a Kindle single, short book about it's a World War II true spy story. It has nothing to do with anything else I've ever written, but it's about a guy who, there's a lot of people who are spy novelists who learned about what they needed to write spy novels by being spies first. This is about a guy who went in the other direction. He was a spy novelist first. In the 1930s, he was Britain's most successful novelist. His name was Dennis Wheatley. I'm sure nobody's heard of him. But he and Agatha Christie were the best-selling authors in Britain until J.K. Rowling came along. And then he had invented this secret agent who was the precursor to James Bond, who constantly tricked the Germans. He fooled Hitler into invading the Soviet Union, and he all these deception operations. And on the basis of this, Wheatley was recruited into Churchill's bunker on the deception staff, and his job became to fool Hitler in real life. And he stayed till the war was essentially over in 1944. Member of a team of at most 7 people. At times he worked alone, and he took the stuff that he had written for Gregory Sallust, his character, and he put it to use in real life, which I thought was brilliant.
And how did you come upon his story? As you said, most of us are not familiar with
Right.
the name. How did you find that?
I was in London on vacation with my family, and we were visiting the Churchill War Rooms, which was the underground bunker that Churchill and his staff worked out of. And there was this picture of Dennis Wheatley, and he was the only guy who wasn't in uniform of everybody there except for Winnie. And it said that he was the only civilian to have joined the Joint Planning Staff, and that he had been a spy novelist, and he used what he learned to deceive Hitler about the invasion of Normandy, which actually was a bit of an overstatement. I mean, he and 15 others did this. It wasn't just him. But I just thought, oh my God, this is really interesting. And I'd never heard anything about him. So I started to research his life.
That's great. That's great. We're going to open it up to questions from you, most of you who have been here before.
And that's called D for deception. Let me
D
just
for
put
deception.
in a plug.
Put in a plug, yeah.
Yeah.
And you said on Kindle.
You can get it on, yeah, it's on, yes, there's an enhanced iPad version for $1 more.
Sounds like a good deal.
Yeah.
We'll take questions from the audience. Those of you in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the little bowl, but on the rim, and ask your question. And otherwise, Ryan will try and get to you with a microphone if you're seated behind the seating bowl. Yes, Barbara.
This is my fourth week in the U.S. and my fourth week in Milwaukee. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about the legacy of conflict and about transitional justice, because that's a big issue in Ireland, between Northern Ireland, and at the moment, I suppose we're living in a post-conflict society, but also dealing with the legacy of the conflict and how we're dealing with that. However, my question isn't about that. I'm on a quest to understand the healthcare system in the US at the moment.
The healthcare system.
So I watch copious amounts of television in an effort to try and understand not just one side or the other, but really what the philosophical underpinnings of the objections to, say, Obamacare or any kind of universal healthcare system. What is it? I'm just interested to know what you think, Tina. What is it in the American psyche, or for a lot of American people, that it just seems to bring up a huge amount of positional thinking? So you're either on, it seems to me. So I'd be just interested to know what your experience of that has been, or whether you have a view on why it is the way it is. Sorry, not the
Boy, I think probably I know less about that than anyone else in this room. I'm not sure I have an answer to the question, but I'm sure other people do.
Other question? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you respond? How do you respond to Rush Limbaugh or Charlie Sykes locally talk radio when you talk about solutions journalism, and they said, "That's exactly what I'm doing. That's what I've been doing for years."
I didn't hear the question. I'm sorry.
He asked, how do you respond? And he cited to people who say, I am doing solutions journalism. He mentioned a couple of people who do talk radio here in town, who I don't think would define themselves as journalists right now. I think they would be the first to say that.
Well, they may be. I mean, we can't take credit for all the solutions journalism in the country. Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel was there before us. But a lot of people who say they're doing solutions journalism, that's not how we would define solutions journalism.
It's more advocacy. Is that what you're?
It can be advocacy. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that sort of we say that's not what we call it. For example, when people say, well, the solution is privatize Social Security, and that's a theoretical solution. It may be a solution, but give me some reporting on where it's working and what effect it's having. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about something that's theoretical. We're not talking about stories that are all about the problem, and in the last paragraph they give you like a few sentences about some responses to it. We're not talking about civic journalism or public journalism or citizen journalism, which are other sort of movements, big ideas in journalism. What we're talking about is probably much more narrow than that. So it may be, they may, by their own definitions, be doing it, but that may not be what our definition is.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about how difficult it is to change journalists' opinions and making them think about solution journalism. Is there anything else in the journalist's hierarchy, the editors or the owners of the media, and how they think about solutions journalism and kind of what sells or what their perception is of what's important to the readers and what they want to read?
But it's a good time. Did everybody hear the question? It's a good time to be trying to change practices in journalism because the business model is tanking and everybody's looking for how we save ourselves. So people are willing to experiment in ways that they might not have been willing 10 years ago. But your question's an interesting one. It is very easy to change opinions, to change the opinions of journalists and editors. It is very difficult to change their behavior, and those things are two different things. And since I've written a book about this, you'd think I would have known that going in, but for some reason it surprised me. We have had experiences where we've worked with an organization, and they seem really gung-ho, and then 3 months later, they haven't done any of it. And, things get in the way. Everybody's busy with their normal work. You don't have time to try and veer off in another direction. The reporters may not perceive it's what editors reward. It may take too many resources they don't have. I mean, there's all these barriers to changing how people do business that are difficult to overcome, and now we're trying to figure out how to overcome some of those challenges. But initially, we would get this response that was, we would talk to reporters, and reporters would say, gee, I think this is a great idea, but my editor isn't going to like it. And then we would talk to the editor, and he would say, I think this is a great idea, but you're not going to be able to sell the reporters on it. Or, people would say, we want to do this, but our public won't stand for it. And then you talk to readers, and they go, are you kidding? This is exactly what we want. So, in a sense, everybody thinks someone else will object to it. And nobody, and our experience has been very few people really do object.
And with fewer resources in the newsroom, is it difficult for reporters to find the time to dedicate to something like that?
It is difficult. And it shouldn't be in a sense, because if you're on a beat, let's say you're covering crime, and you will spend a lot of your time doing feature stories that are about that aren't hard. Feature story is not hard news. It's covering things like I don't know, a neighborhood that's been victims, that has many crime victims in it, or a particular prison or something, and those feature stories are usually going to be examples of problems. It shouldn't be any more difficult to add some examples of things that work to your beat, but it has to be done with intentionality. You have to sit down and say, now let me look for things that work, because problems tend to shout at you and solutions tend to whisper. You don't hear about them. They don't come up in your consciousness. So that's part of the problem. But, for example, with the Seattle Times, the reason that they're able to do this incredibly ambitious undertaking is that we got a large amount of foundation money that is financing this for them. And without that, it's more difficult.
I don't want to put Marty on the spot. Marty is here taking notes, but Marty Kaiser is the editor of the newspaper here in town, Journal-Sentinel. What was the response from staff and from the public when the paper started doing more and more of, I think, what Tina would describe as the solutions journalism approach? What kind of response did you get internally and externally?
Very positive. I mean, Tina and I have met before and talked about this before, and one of the interesting things when I got into business, you went out and you did a series and you said, here's what's wrong, and then left it and sort of moved on to something else. And to me, that's not doing complete reporting on the job. And I don't mean, like Tina's talking about, dictating to people, here's how you go to fix it, like the town scold. But real reporting is saying, here's how it's being dealt with other places. Here's solutions that we might consider. It's telling the full story. And the reaction has really always been very good from, nope, I don't have a lot of problems in the newsroom. You need to give people time to do it, but to me, it's part of the story. It's not completed. If you haven't done the real work, that's where Tina's point is really good. And readers appreciate it. The complaint I used to hear years ago from readers is, well, great, you told us what a mess it is. Who's doing it right? There's got to be some people who have some answers. Go out and find them.
Mm-hmm. All right, Marty, thanks. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Two questions. One, hold it down.
The rim, not the ball, the rim. Yeah, that's okay. Ryan has found it, so you're good.
The first is a simple question. How do we find this fix-it column on the Times online? I find it by chance. Is it there regularly? Am I missing it on the left-hand column or what?
You look at www.nytimes.com/fixes. And they're all there, every single one of them.
The second question, more complicated. I thought the stories and examples in Join the Group were incredibly imaginative. And I can't help thinking, I've been following the NFL concussion series, and especially Frontline last week, that for me was a game changer. How do you follow up on that to translate that into, let's stop football. Let's stop the million grade school and high school kids that play football, not to mention the whole rest. Is that part of a Fix-It column or another book or a whole movement?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I mean, I guess I would start thinking about it by looking to see whether there's a similar situation where people have found a solution. And I don't think anybody thinks the solution is stopping football. But, if there is something comparable, that would probably be a clue to what you would look at. But that's a very good suggestion. Haven't thought about it.
Yes, sir.
Question. All right. So two-part question. When you talk about the problem and the solution, I feel like a lot of times, if someone doesn't understand the problem completely, they're not going to understand because there's a lot of different solutions oftentimes, or people think there are a lot of different solutions. So do you find it hard to incorporate all those different solutions, or do you try to go for one solution? And that's my first question. My second question is, what do you think in terms of, you said journalistic, like the way journalists do business in newspapers is failing, and it's been going down for a while. Do you think there's a lot of potential in online, live reporting from events? Because some online newspapers have done recently, like The Guardian and Reuters. Do you think that's going to continue in the future?
Could you tell me what he said? I didn't hear him.
Okay. A couple of questions here. He was kind of talking about the future of journalism. We'll take the last one first. The future of journalism, and about whether the online content will be sort of the dominating.
Some of them have gone on to live blog. I guess blogging would be the way to call it, or coverage. And do you think? Because I personally think that's one big way newspapers could kind of reclaim their lost spot. And then the other one was the problem for complex problems, the many different solutions. How do you comb through them and figure out which one?
His first question was too, and so that's the second question. And his first question was about, sometimes when you're reporting on a problem, there might be multiple solutions suggested. And how can you report on all of them, or do you have to say we're going to focus on this one?
You'll never find which one's the best, and you'll never find all of them. So the criteria is this a good story? Is this something that is interesting enough and significant enough that I want to put it in my publication? And it will certainly not be the best one, and you can't attempt to be comprehensive. So I think my answer is, report on one, and then you may want to report on another one. But as long as you don't sell it as more than what it is, it's fine if it's not the best one or the most successful one. And I'm sorry, I didn't hear what he said.
I think it's the future of media. I think it's a larger question about future of media. What is it going to look like? Will it be much more about live reporting of events online, live blogging about things that are happening? Is that the future, given where the business model stands today?
No idea.
Believe me, there are a lot of people trying to predict the future in the media business. So far, we're still searching. So, yeah, right.
How do you, since politics invades or infects virtually everything we do these days, how do you, in solution journalism, avoid getting snarled up with huge political controversies where solutions are suggested which may please Republicans or Democrats? How do you avoid those?
How do you avoid getting snarled up in what?
In the political debates that occur. Maybe you'll report on a solution, and And you know how it is in our world today, depending on what
Right.
that solution is,
Right.
you end up embroiled in
Right.
the politics.
Well, how people are going to respond to what you write is something that you cannot control. But one of the good things about solutions journalism is that it changes the debate a little. It depolarizes it a little. It's like, we use comparison. Traditional journalism would be the equivalent of if you're saying, can a person in a wheelchair drive a car? The solutions version of that story is you'd say, how can we make a car that a person in a wheelchair can drive? And that's two completely different debates. And you find when you write a solution story, and I'm wondering, I know you didn't have comments, you didn't accept comments on some of Meg's stories in the Chronic Crisis series, but the comments we get from solution stories are very different. They're much more focused on the how-to and the technology and what if we did this, and it's a much more collaborative process and much less overtly political, this isn't correct, this is correct. So I think it helps a bit. But in the end, overall, there's always going to be people who don't like something that works because it doesn't fit into their ideological view of what should work, no matter what the evidence is. And that's not as a journalist, you can't do anything about that.
I'm going to go to this side of the room, Joanne, and then we'll go up this way.
Let me ask you about the different types of media. If you're working for a print outlet, which is also online now, you often have enough time to do this kind of journalism. If you're working for a television station, you don't have that kind of time. That's the first part of the question. How do we convince television that it's valuable to do this kind of journalism? And the other question is, if you find a subject that's very big and you're interested in it, and another station or another news outlet is also interested in it, it makes sense to collaborate. But what about the competition aspect of doing that story together?
Well, both of these questions could just as well be asked about more traditional reporting, and the answer would be the same. I never understood why TV stations felt they didn't have time to do a 2-minute story that's more in-depth, even in traditional form of journalism. But clearly they don't think they do have that time. So as long as they don't think they can do that, they probably don't think they can do a 2-minute solutions-focused story either. In my opinion, that's a mistake. But, I'm not running local TV news. And the collaboration questions are really the same as they would be for any other story. I think it's unusual to have competitors collaborate on a story. There's unless you happen to be Colombian newspapers writing about, the drug war, and then you're publishing the same story in every newspaper in the country simultaneously with no bylines for reporter safety. That happens, but that's pretty unusual in the United States. So I'm not sure that the question comes up very much, but maybe you have a specific example in mind.
There might be a story that's of interest to a local commercial television station and is also of interest to a local public television station. But they are basically competing with one another.
I see.
However, the value in doing the story together for the common good, for the good of the public, is there. Can they be convinced to work together, or does that competition still get in the way?
It's no different than if it were a traditional story. I'd say, it's unusual. Now, having said that, there's many different angles to a story, and news stations cover the same thing all the time. In fact, they mostly cover the same thing. It's very rare when you're covering something that your competition isn't covering. You bring something different to it. You try and find a different angle to it. So that can certainly happen.
Yes.
What can the community do to help solutions journalism? So from the perspective, you talked about how bad news shouts and solutions whisper. How can the community help shout the solution stories that are out there, which are out there? And so one of the things I love about Milwaukee is that we invest in solutions. It's not just theoretical ideas. And so what can, is it getting beyond the traditional press release take?
So I work in the city's sustainability office. So what can we do to help share those solution stories?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I think what readers can do is if they like a solution story, write comments in on it, email it around, write letters to the editor, just give the newspaper some love for running it, and that'll encourage them to do more like it, I guess. If you're a potential source, then I get probably 20 press releases a day from organizations that want me to cover their solution. 19 and a half of them are not, but they don't fit my criteria. They may not have any evidence that they work. They may be no different than what's going on anywhere else. They may be, just a story about a nice kid who's running a lemonade stand to benefit his neighbor who's got cancer. That's a nice story. That's not what I'm talking about. It's a solution story. So, I guess in terms of proposing stories to reporters, my advice would just be to be as professional as possible and really think through what it is the reporter needs and help them to get it and help that person to think about what you're offering them in that way. But that's sort of standard advice to people who are trying to promote their organization. It's really no different from solution.
One more question in the back, and then we'll probably wrap things up. Thank you.
Outside of just turning our computers off, and I'm not pointing at television news or print journalism, but when you're reading a follow-up story to a crime story and they're reporting on a vigil, and you scroll down to the bottom and hear all these comments, and there's someone, the very first comment that's allowed online is the bait, and it's a hateful, bullying statement. And then you find the rest of the community following up with all of these other e-comments. And instead of saying, oh, God bless, blah, 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 we're so sorry about the family, it's hateful, it's bullying. I'm not going to mention the story or the news station, but that to me is still a huge, huge problem in any type of news reporting, especially in our city, for all the good that we're doing. How do we stop that? The news stations, can they just turn off the comments and block them? It's a big problem, I feel.
Just let me ask you, how do you feel about comments after stories? Do you like them? Everybody wrestles with that as an issue. Sometimes they're really good, and sometimes it really devolves into something that's not very pleasant.
Well, I think comments need to be moderated, and that's a lot of work to do that. I think a lot of papers just sort of, every comment gets printed, and that, unless they have words in them that trigger certain computer programs that say, But I think, for fixes, we moderate comments. We very rarely don't let things through, but it's basically when it's offensive or really invective or something completely off the topic. But I think comments are really important. I do, in general. And some of them are really interesting and really constructive, and I love it when commenters can get into a debate with each other and answer each other, and that's really cool.
I'm going to wrap things up there, but I do want to remind people in this room that our next event will be October 29th. That will be the next release of the Marquette Law School poll, so we'll have new polling numbers just about a year out from the November 2014 election. So we hope that you'll join us for that. It'll be at 12:15, same time as this one. And having said that, I want to thank everybody in this room for attending, for your interest, and we especially want to thank Tina Rosenberg for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.